Do you really think I don't notice? Tom's voice was low, but every word hit like a whip. He stood by the window, staring into the darkness that concealed the abyss beyond their home. Elizabeth, his wife, sat at the dining table, absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her wineglass with her finger. She forced a smile, but inside, her chest tightened with anxiety. "Tom, what are you talking about?" Her voice was soft, almost innocent. He spun around abruptly, his gaze cold as ice. "You know exactly what I'm talking about, Liz. Don't pretend like nothing's happening." She turned away, picked up her glass, and took a sip, trying to steady the trembling in her hand. "You've become so suspicious lately," she said. "It's exhausting." Tom took a step forward, his silhouette under the lamplight eerily calm. "Suspicious? Or just observant?" He smirked, leaning on the back of a chair. "Why don't you tell me again how you spent your day?" Elizabeth felt her breathing quicken. His calmness was more threatening than shouting ever could be. "I was in town, as usual. Bought groceries, picked up a dress from the dry cleaner. You can check the receipts if you want," she said with a smile that barely masked her unease. Tom nodded, but his eyes carried something far heavier than simple agreement. "Of course. Town, dry cleaner, predictable as always." He paused deliberately before adding, "And meeting Jason? Was that part of the list too?" The glass in Elizabeth's hand froze midair. She looked at her husband, trying not to reveal her shock. You're talking about Jason? We ran into each other. Just a casual conversation." Tom tilted his head, his smirk widening. "I told you, Liz, I notice everything." Elizabeth felt her world begin to crumble. She didn't know exactly what Tom had uncovered, but she was certain this night wouldn't end peacefully. Silence enveloped the room like a heavy, suffocating shroud. Elizabeth tried to maintain her composure, but her heart pounded so loudly it felt as though Tom could hear it. She set her wineglass on the table to hide the tremor in her hand, yet her husband's gaze, sharp as a blade, pierced right through her. "You're clearly plotting something, Tom," she finally said, forcing herself to appear confident. "Your accusations? What exactly are you trying to say?" He took a few steps closer, his shadow stretching long and ominous across the wall. "These aren't accusations, Liz." His voice sounded as though he was stating the obvious. "They're observations. And so far, you've only been proving them right." Elizabeth felt her stomach turn. What did he mean? What did he know? And how far was he willing to go to uncover the truth? Observations? She raised an eyebrow, feigning surprise. "Are you spying on me now?" Tom smirked, though his eyes remained icy. "Spying?" he repeated with a faint trace of sarcasm. "Let's just say I've been paying closer attention. You encouraged me to, didn't you?" "Tom, this is paranoia," she snapped. "I've never given you a reason to doubt my honesty." "Really?" Tom sat down across from her, folding his hands on the table. His calmness was unbearable. "Then why were you in that neighborhood last night, Liz?" She froze. The words caught in her throat, and her thoughts tangled like threads in a hastily unraveled sweater. "What are you talking about?" she finally managed. "The little cafe on the corner of Brighton Street," he said calmly. "You know, the one you supposedly haven't visited in weeks." Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. "He knows. But how?" "It's just a coincidence," she said quickly, trying to keep her voice steady. "I stopped by on a whim, just for a minute." "What's the big deal?" Tom nodded, as if he agreed. "For a minute? Interesting." He leaned in closer, his face now inches from hers. "Then I must have imagined you staying there for 2 hours." Her breathing grew shallow. She felt trapped, caught in a snare with no way out. "This is ridiculous, Tom," she said, forcing a laugh. "You're following me? That's not normal." "Not normal?" He stood, his voice growing louder, but still holding a dangerous restraint. "And what is normal, Liz? Lying to me? Hiding your meetings with Jason?" Elizabeth shot to her feet, her eyes glinting with a mixture of anger and fear. "I'm not hiding anything," she shouted. "You've made up this entire damn story." Tom straightened, his expression remaining impassive, though something dark flickered in his eyes. "Fine, Liz," he said. stepping back toward the window. Then you have nothing to worry about, right? She didn't answer, only watched him, trying to anticipate his next move. Just remember, Tom added, not turning around. Our house is perched on the edge of a cliff. One wrong step, and we both could fall. Elizabeth felt his words sear into her, leaving a bitter aftertaste. Tom knew something of that, she was certain. The only question was how much time she had left to set things right. Elizabeth barely held herself together, struggling not to break under the pressure. His confidence, his calmness, it all unsettled her. But the fear nesting in her chest was stronger than her anger. Tom knew more than he was letting on, but how far was he willing to go? She worked hard to appear composed, though panic raged inside her. Tom, I'm tired of your insinuations, she said, crossing her arms. If you have something to say it outright. He turned to her, his face unreadable, like a mask devoid of emotion. Fine, Liz, he said, his voice as cold as ice. You want me to be direct? Let's be direct. He reached for the pocket of his jacket hanging on the chair and pulled out a small envelope. The air in the room instantly felt heavier. What is that? She asked, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. Evidence, he replied simply, tossing the envelope onto the table in front of her. Elizabeth hesitated, staring at it as though it might explode. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up and opened it. Inside were photographs. The first photo showed her, sitting at a table in a small cafe. Across from her sat Jason, Tom's best friend. He was smiling, holding her hand, and she appeared to be smiling back. Elizabeth felt her throat tighten. This is just a friendly meeting, she began, unable to meet his eyes. Really? Tom folded his arms across his chest. You're holding his hand, Liz. Is that just a friendly gesture too? She swallowed the lump in her throat, struggling to find the words. You're taking this out of context. We were just talking. Tom nodded, as if agreeing, but his eyes were still sharp and unrelenting. All right, then let's look at the other photos. He reached out, flipping through the stack. The next photo showed her and Jason standing close together, with him leaning in to whisper something in her ear. The next captured her laughing, while Jason gazed at her with unmistakable admiration. Tom, this isn't fair. Elizabeth raised her voice, shoving the photos away. You're looking for something that isn't there. Maybe, he said with a slight nod. But you know what's odd? Jason never mentioned meeting you. She felt her heart stop. You talked to him, she whispered. Not yet, Tom admitted, a glint in his eye. But I will. Elizabeth stepped forward, placing her hands on the table. Tom, please, she pleaded, her voice soft, almost begging. You're misunderstanding everything. We're just friends, nothing more. He smirked and stood up. All right, Liz. If that's true, then you have nothing to worry about. I'll talk to Jason tomorrow. She tried to find the words to stop him but couldn't. He was already heading for the door. Before leaving, he glanced over his shoulder and said, Enjoy your quiet night, Liz. You're going to need it. The door slammed, leaving Elizabeth alone. Her eyes fell on the photos, and a chill ran through her. Tom knew too much, but what exactly was he planning? One thing was certain. If he talked to Jason, everything would fall apart. She needed to act, and fast. Elizabeth sat at the table for what felt like hours, staring at the photographs as though her gaze alone might make them vanish. She felt cornered, trapped. Tom wasn't the kind of man who could be fooled or persuaded to forget. His calm demeanor always meant one thing. He had already thought everything through. But what did he actually know? How much time did she have left to stop this disaster? She reached for her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found Jason's number. The phone rang endlessly before he finally answered. Elizabeth, do you know what time it is? His voice was groggy but laced with suspicion. We have a problem, Jason, she said quickly, forcing her words to come out clearly. Tom suspects something. He has photos of us at the cafe. There was silence on the line. What kind of photos? He asked at last. Of us together, Elizabeth whispered. And he plans to talk to you. Tomorrow. Damn it, Jason swore, and she could hear the tension in his voice. Are you sure he knows everything? I don't know what he knows, she admitted. But he's toying with me, Jason. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. And what does he want? Jason's voice was almost a shout. Isn't it obvious? She hissed. He wants the truth. And I don't think I can stop him. Jason was quiet for a moment, then said, Listen, Elizabeth. If he finds out, we're both finished. We need to figure something out. Like what? She replied bitterly. Tom isn't stupid. He's already made his first move, and the next one could be the last. I'll talk to him, Jason said abruptly. Elizabeth froze. You don't understand, Jason. That's a terrible idea. Tom will believe you if you just tell him nothing happened. Then Jason hesitated. I'll just try to play it another way. No, she cut him off. You're not doing anything until I figure this out. I'll think of something. You have a plan? Skepticism colored his voice. Not yet, she admitted, closing her eyes. But he can't find out anything more. All right, Jason sighed. But if Tom starts asking questions, I can't just stay silent, Elizabeth. He's my friend. Jason, please, she begged. I'm asking you to do nothing. She hung up, her panic mounting. Elizabeth knew that one wrong move would shatter their world completely. But she still had one hope. If she could take back control, she might have a chance. She looked at the photographs again. A plan was beginning to take shape in her mind. Dangerous, nearly reckless, but it was the only one that might work. By morning, she would put it into action. Morning arrived with an unsettling silence. Tom had already left for work, leaving a note on the kitchen table. I'll be back later. Make sure we have time to talk. Tom. Elizabeth clenched the note in her hand. Her nerves were frayed, but she knew she couldn't afford to show any weakness now. Grabbing her phone, she dialed Jason's number once more. We need to meet, she said as soon as he answered. Liz, this is a bad idea, he replied instantly. I have a plan. Her voice was firm, though fear churned inside her. I won't let him destroy everything we've built. Jason was silent for a few seconds before asking, where and when? In an hour, at the park where we used to meet. Bring anything that could incriminate us. Liz, he started, but she cut him off. Just trust me. When Elizabeth arrived at the park, Jason was already waiting. He looked tense, constantly glancing around. I'm not sure this is a good idea, he said as she sat beside him on the bench. We have to move faster than he does, Elizabeth replied, scanning the park to ensure no one was listening. And what exactly do you want to do? Jason folded his arms. Leaning in close, she lowered her voice. Tom thinks I'm lying, but he doesn't know how far I'm willing to go to hide the truth. We'll make it so he falls into his own trap. Liz, do you even realize who you're playing with? Jason shook his head. Tom's smarter than you think. That's why I need you, she said, placing a hand on his shoulder. You need to tell him everything. Jason pulled back in shock. Are you insane? That'll only make things worse. Not everything, she said coldly. You'll tell him that I tried to seduce you, but you turned me down. Make it seem like I'm the guilty one to throw him off. Jason froze, stunned by her suggestion. You want me to betray you to save us? It's not betrayal, she said, her tone steely. It's the only way to protect our future. Jason closed his eyes and ran a hand down his face. And what if he still doesn't believe me? He will, Elizabeth said confidently. Tom has always trusted you. Just make it convincing. Jason was quiet for a long time before finally nodding. Fine, he said. But if this backfires, we're both done. Elizabeth squeezed his hand. We'll manage. We don't have a choice. When she returned home, she felt a flicker of control returning to her. Now everything hinged on Jason and his ability to sell the story. But as soon as she stepped through the door, her heart stopped. On the kitchen table was another envelope. Written on the front was the address of the cafe and a date. Inside was a flash drive and a short note. I'm sure you'll want to see this. Tom. Elizabeth felt a chill run through her. What did he know? And what was on that flash drive? Her hands trembled as she inserted the drive into her laptop. The screen flickered, and a video began to play. On the screen, she saw herself and Jason, sitting at the same cafe table. The camera captured him touching her hand, her leaning in closer. Their exchanged glances. The room grew colder as she watched her world crumble before her eyes. Tom didn't just suspect. He knew. And now she understood. The plan she had just devised might already be useless. Tom had already set his trap, and she was caught in it. Elizabeth froze in front of the screen, watching the video unfold with merciless clarity. Every gesture, every smile exchanged between her and Jason hinted at more than just friendship. Tom knew. Now only one question remained. What did he plan to do with this information? The sound of a car outside jolted her to her feet, as though she'd been caught red-handed. Tom was back. She quickly shut the laptop, stuffed the flash drive back into the envelope, and shoved it into the kitchen drawer. The door opened, and Tom stepped in, carrying a folder of papers. His demeanor was unnervingly calm, as if oblivious to the chaos his note had unleashed. "You're home early," he remarked, glancing at her. "Yes, I just got back," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He didn't respond, only nodded and headed to the fridge. Elizabeth watched his every move, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "Was there something you wanted to show me?" she asked at last, referring to the flash drive. Tom smirked slightly as he grabbed a bottle of water. "Already saw it?" Elizabeth felt her chest tighten. "Yes," she said, forcing herself to sound confident. "It's just meaningless clips. I'm surprised you even bothered recording them." Tom laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Meaningless? Interesting choice of words. He stepped closer, and Elizabeth felt her legs threaten to give out beneath her. "So, what would you call meaningful, Liz? Dinner with Jason at our house? Maybe a midnight stroll? Or do you think I'm blind?" Her eyes widened, but she quickly composed herself. "Tom, this isn't what it looks like. You're seeing things that aren't there." "Really?" he said, leaning in, his voice low and threatening. "Then explain to me how it's supposed to look." She forced a smile, though everything inside her screamed to run. "I already told you. We're just friends. Nothing more." Tom stepped back, his smile turning colder. "All right," he said. "Then I have a proposal." Elizabeth's guard shot up. "What kind of proposal?" "Tomorrow night, I'm hosting a dinner. You, me, and Jason." Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her. "Jason?" she repeated, trying to mask her panic. "Yes," Tom confirmed calmly. "If there's nothing to hide, the dinner will be perfectly pleasant. Won't it?" Her head spun as his words sank in. Tom was tightening the noose, and she had no idea how to escape. "You're serious?" she asked, hoping this was a bluff. "Completely," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "See you tomorrow night." Tom left the room, leaving her alone with her thoughts spiraling out of control. In a panic, Elizabeth grabbed her phone and dialed Jason. "Dinner," she said hurriedly as soon as he picked up. "What?" he asked, clearly confused. "Tom's hosting a dinner tomorrow night. You, me, and him." Jason went silent, processing what she just said. "This is the end, Liz," he said finally. "It's not the end," she snapped. "We can still turn this around." "How?" he asked, his voice heavy with doubt. "We prepare. Make it seem like this is all just a ridiculous misunderstanding. You have to stay confident." "Liz, I'm not sure I can." "You can," she interrupted sharply. "We don't have a choice." Jason sighed. "Fine, but if he starts asking too many questions, just stick to the story. Nothing happened." She cut him off. "It's our only chance." She hung up, her hands trembling. Tomorrow's dinner could be the final act in this game, and Elizabeth knew the stakes were too high to lose. Taking a deep breath, she tried to steady her nerves. If Tom wanted to play, she would play. But she had no intention of being the one to fall over the edge. The next evening arrived far sooner than Elizabeth had anticipated. Tom was unnervingly calm, even cheerful, as he set the table with precise care. His serenity unnerved her more than any accusations could have. She watched as he meticulously arranged the glasses and silverware, as if preparing not for a dinner, but for some solemn ceremony. "You're putting so much effort into this," she remarked, trying to sound casual. "Of course," Tom replied without looking up. "For an occasion like this, I always give my best." She tensed at his words. What did he mean by that? The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat. Jason, I'll get it, Tom offered with a light smile and headed to the door. When he returned with Jason, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Silence hung heavy, like a dense fog. Jason tried to appear confident, but the unease in his eyes was unmistakable. Jason, it's good to see you, Tom said, shaking his hand. Thanks for coming. Of course, Tom, Jason replied, trying to sound steady. Always happy to have dinner with friends. Tom smirked, his eyes glinting. Then let's sit down. They took their places at the table, and Elizabeth felt the tension rise to unbearable levels. Tom poured wine for everyone, raised his glass and said, "To friendship." Elizabeth forced herself to smile and took a sip. At first, Tom kept the conversation light, discussing mundane topics like the weather, work, and news. But every time Jason answered, Tom's gaze lingered on him, as though searching for something hidden beneath his words. Finally, after a long sip of wine, Tom set his glass down and said, "You know, I've been thinking a lot lately about how important trust is." Elizabeth tensed but stayed silent. Trust is the foundation of any relationship, Tom continued. Especially relationships like ours, husband, wife, and best friend. Jason stiffened but tried to hide it. "Of course, Tom," he said cautiously. "Trust is everything." "Exactly," Tom agreed with a nod. "Which is why I thought tonight would be a good time to address something important." Elizabeth felt a chill run down her spine. "Tom, let's not ruin the evening," she interjected, trying to keep her voice steady. He raised a hand, silencing her. "This is important, Liz," he said. "I think you'll both agree." He turned his gaze to Jason, his expression hardening. "Jason, you're my friend, right?" "Of course, Tom," Jason answered, though his voice wavered slightly. "Then tell me," Tom pressed, "what would you do if someone in your life was lying to you?" Jason hesitated. "Well, I suppose I'd try to understand why they did it." Tom nodded, smiling faintly. "Good answer. And what if it was, let's say, my wife?" Elizabeth barely managed to keep herself from jumping out of her chair. "Tom, that's enough," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You're crossing a line." "No, Liz," he said coldly. "I'm just asking." "So, Jason, what would you do?" Jason stared down at his glass, then back at Tom. "Tom, I don't think this is an appropriate topic for dinner." Tom laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Appropriate or not, we're here. And I want to know." He stood, walked to a cabinet, and pulled out a flash drive. Elizabeth felt her stomach drop. "I think it'll be easier if I just show you." He inserted the flash drive into the laptop on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up, and the three of them froze as the video began to play. The cafe appeared on the screen again. There she was, sitting across from Jason. The gestures, the smiles, the tilted heads, everything was captured in excruciating detail. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. "Well," Tom said, looking directly at them, "care to explain this?" Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. Elizabeth forced herself to speak. "Tom, this isn't what you think," she blurted, forgetting the carefully rehearsed excuses. "Really?" His voice was low, cold. "Then explain, Liz. Explain why my best friend is holding your hand while you smile at him." Her world was collapsing, but she knew there was still a chance to turn it around. "Because I knew you were watching me, Tom," she shouted, seizing on the only explanation she could think of. "I knew you were looking for a reason to accuse me, so I decided to test you." Tom narrowed his eyes, clearly weighing her words. "Test me?" "Yes." She clung to her story like a lifeline. "I wanted to see how far you'd go, and now I see how you manipulate the facts." Tom stared at her silently for a long moment, then shifted his gaze to Jason. "And you, my friend?" he asked. "What do you have to say?" Jason hesitated, but finally said, "Tom, it's true. We didn't do anything wrong." Tom straightened, his face unreadable. "Fine," he said after a long pause. "Then prove it." Elizabeth and Jason exchanged panicked glances, realizing their time was running out. A suffocating silence filled the room. Tom sat with his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Elizabeth and Jason. His piercing eyes seemed to cut through their defenses, as if he already knew the truth but wanted them to destroy their own alibi. How do you expect us to prove it? Elizabeth asked, trying to sound firm, though her voice trembled. Tom smirked, a predator's smile, one that signaled he'd already cornered his prey. Simple, he said, sitting back and taking a sip of his wine. Tell me your version of events. But take turns. No pauses. No inconsistencies. If your stories match, I'll believe you. Elizabeth's stomach dropped. He knew this was nearly impossible. Even if they had prepared, one small inconsistency could unravel everything. Fine, she said, forcing herself to stay calm. Who goes first? Tom leaned back in his chair like a director observing actors on stage. Liz, you start. Tell me what happened that day. She took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of composure. I went to the cafe after running errands, she began. It was purely by chance. I saw Jason and decided to talk to him. We discussed, she hesitated briefly, work issues, and we talked a little about you. Tom raised an eyebrow. Oh, what about me? I told him you'd been working a lot and that I was worried about you, she said, trying to sound sincere. Worried about me? Tom chuckled, but the humor didn't reach his eyes. How touching. Go on. We sat there for 20, maybe 30 minutes. Then I left, she finished with a forced smile. Tom turned his gaze to Jason. Your turn. Jason shot a quick glance at Elizabeth before nodding. Yes, we met by chance, he began, avoiding any specifics. Elizabeth did talk about you. She's concerned about how hard you've been working. We also discussed your latest project, work in general. That's all. Then we said goodbye. Tom frowned but stayed silent, swirling his wine in his glass. After a moment, he leaned forward, setting the glass down. Interesting, he said softly. You both forgot to mention one detail. Elizabeth's heart froze. What detail? She asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Tom leaned closer, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. The part where you put your hand on his, Liz, and the part where he leans in to whisper something in your ear. Elizabeth felt a cold wave of panic wash over her. It was just a friendly gesture, she blurted, desperation creeping into her voice. A friendly gesture? Tom's smirk widened as he stood. Let's all see for ourselves, shall we? He pulled out another flash drive from his pocket and inserted it into the laptop. The screen lit up, showing new footage of the cafe from a different angle. This time, the camera clearly captured Jason leaning toward Elizabeth, her hand resting on his, and his hand lightly touching her shoulder. The interaction looked far more intimate than anything they could plausibly call innocent. Well, Tom said, looking directly at them, do you still want to convince me there's nothing going on? Jason opened his mouth, but no words came. Elizabeth forced herself to speak. Tom, this is a misunderstanding, she said, her voice shaking. We didn't mean for it to look like that. Look like what? Tom cut her off sharply. Like betrayal? Jason stood abruptly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. Tom, listen. I would never betray you. We were just close friends. That's all. Tom turned to him with a sharp glare, his eyes glinting dangerously. Close friends? You call that close friendship? He walked to a cabinet and retrieved a small recording device. You know, Jason, Tom said, his tone mockingly casual. Sometimes people tell the truth when they think no one's listening. He pressed a button, and Jason's voice filled the room. Liz, if he finds out, we're finished. We have to stick together to keep this from coming out. Elizabeth clapped a hand over her mouth, while Jason's face drained of color. You recorded us? Jason stammered, his voice shaking. No, Jason, Tom replied coldly. I recorded the truth. Elizabeth felt the floor drop out from under her. Tom had been one step ahead the entire time, and now there was no escape. She didn't know how they could possibly recover from this. The silence in the room was deafening. Elizabeth and Jason sat frozen, as though any movement or sound might seal their fate. Tom stood before them, his face unreadable, but his eyes burned with the confidence of a man who had already won. Well, Liz? Jason? He said, his voice slicing through the air like a knife. Are you going to tell me why you tried to hide this? Tom, It's not what you think, Elizabeth managed to say, struggling to steady her voice. Not what I think, Tom repeated, a sardonic smile curling his lips. Liz, what I think is this. You betrayed me. Or am I wrong? Jason tried to interject. Tom, I never wanted it to get this far. It was just what, Jason? Tom snapped, turning his sharp gaze on him. Just a casual coffee? Just a bit of flirting? Just a secret relationship behind my back? It wasn't a relationship. Elizabeth burst out. We didn't do anything. Tom stepped closer, his face mere inches from hers. Then why do you both look like you're about to collapse from fear? Elizabeth turned away, unable to meet his gaze. All right, Tom said, straightening up. If you're both going to deny the obvious, let me help you. He reached into his pocket and pulled out another envelope, tossing it onto the table. In here, he said, is everything I need to ruin your lives. Photos, recordings, even what I found on your phone, Liz. Elizabeth's eyes widened, and she felt a chill run down her spine. You went through my phone? She asked, her voice trembling. Of course, Tom said with a shrug. Trust, Liz. You broke it, so I decided to find the truth myself. Jason buried his head in his hands, as if trying to process everything. Tom, you can't, he began. Oh, I can, Tom interrupted. And I will. But you have a chance. Elizabeth's head shot up. A chance? Yes, Tom said, his voice cold and calculating. He no longer seemed like an angry husband, but a strategist unveiling his masterstroke. What do you want? Jason asked, his voice full of desperation. It's simple, Tom replied. Jason, you disappear from our lives. Leave your job, your friends, everything. You'll never come near us again. And me? Elizabeth whispered, her voice trembling. Tom turned to her, his expression impassive. You stay, and we go on living together as though nothing happened. You want to continue this marriage? She asked, disbelief evident in her voice. Oh, no, Liz, Tom said with a bitter smile. This won't be a marriage anymore. It'll be a deal. You'll stay because it suits me. His words hit harder than she expected, leaving her stunned. And if we refuse? Jason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Tom smirked and gestured to the envelope on the table. Then I send this to your boss, your family, and everyone you know. And as for you, Liz, I'll throw you out of this house and take everything you have. Elizabeth covered her face with her hands, tears welling in her eyes. This is madness, Tom, she whispered. No, Liz, Tom said, leaning closer. This is justice. Jason stood, his shoulders slumped. I'll leave, he said quietly, his voice filled with resignation. But Tom, you're making a mistake. A mistake? Tom laughed, a humorless sound. The mistake was trusting you two. Now I'm just fixing it. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving them in oppressive silence. Elizabeth sat motionless, unable to lift her head. I'm sorry, Liz, Jason said softly. I'll go, but you need to understand. He won't let us go. She didn't respond, knowing full well the truth in his words. She had become a prisoner of her own actions, and now there was no way out.